Hi, good morning, everybody, or I should say good evening to those of you joining us from China. James Heimowitz, I'm the president of China Institute, and it's a delight and an honor and a pleasure to just give a minute or two opening remarks for what promises to be a really exciting program today. Confucius, I think about China Institute and our mission, and I think about how timely it is and how timeless our mission is, and how integral thinking about other systems and other places and thinkers like Confucius are integral to everything that we do. And everybody watching this program and tuning in knows what a terribly difficult time this is, particularly for those of us based in New York, but for the whole planet as we try to figure out what our future looks like. And I can't think of a time that's more important than ever to where dialogue is needed to have a connection and a connectivity with and a connection between what I think are the two most important countries on this planet, which is China and New York. And I think about how our own China Institute has migrated from on-site to online and the traction that we're getting. I'm so encouraged and heartwarmed to see that we have nearly 200 people with us today, to see that our attendance and programs are more robust than ever. And I encourage all of you to check out the China Institute website, to sign up, and to share your voice that we believe in dialogue and that we believe in collaboration and we believe in an open and exchange of ideas and opinions. And it's in that spirit that I'm delighted to partner today with the Cheung Graduate School of Business. Mary Darby's joined us. Mary Darby is a friend not only to the US and to China, but as a former past trustee of the China Institute has been deeply involved in thinking about how China and the US connect and collaborate. And it's just a treat and a pleasure today to be able to say welcome to all of you. Looking forward to hearing this robust discussion at a time, and we couldn't need it more than we need it now. So let me hand it over to Mary.
Thank you, James. Thank you so much. And CKGSB Americas is very pleased to again collaborate with China Institute, which, as James has briefly described, is really an extraordinary place for discussion and collaboration and reaching out and teaching. Our related school in China, Cheung Graduate School of Business, for those that don't know it, is one of the leading preeminent business schools in China with campuses in Beijing, Shanghai, and Shenzhen. We're known for our research, our world-class faculty hired from all over the globe, and our more than 12,000 alum, including many of the CEOs and founders of the top 100 businesses in China. We are especially pleased today to participate in this webinar on Confucius with China Institute and with Professor WANG Jianbao, a universally esteemed Confucian scholar and professor at CKGSB. Welcome you all. We're all delighted to participate, and we're very excited about what we know will be a very interesting discussion that follows. Dinda?
Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Mary. So my name is Dinda Elliott. I'm the Director of Programs at China Institute, and we're thrilled to have all of you join us this morning and this evening. So thanks so much for tuning in. As James mentioned, we've been doing a lot of virtual programs in the last 6 weeks or so. We're very proud that we launched the Beyond COVID-19 series, and one of them featuring Kishore Mahbubani and Graham Allison has been viewed by more than 100,000 people so far, so that we're very excited about that. And we're thrilled again that we have almost 200 people signed up today. I also wanted to mention that we're launching a new series called Pieces of China that will feature one luminary each time talking about one Chinese object. And that through doing that, we will be telling the story of China through individual objects. And we think that will be very fun and interesting and compelling. I want to encourage you also to become members of China Institute. Membership is not expensive, and with membership you get all kinds of discounts to programs like this and to classes and exclusive access to special events. But just as important, membership really means that you're supporting the work of China Institute. And as James said, We're about promoting dialogue at a time when it's more important than ever. And your support will help us to continue providing to the public a more nuanced view of China at a time when it's very, very important. So today it's my great pleasure to introduce our wonderful speakers to talk about an ancient topic that now takes on new relevance, Confucianism. Who knew that so many people were interested in Confucius, by the way? We were very delighted when we saw that 200 people had signed up for this event. We have two of the great experts on that topic with us today, beaming in from Shanghai. So I want to thank all three of you for joining. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our three speakers. Daniel Bell is Dean of the School of Political Science and Public Administration at Shandong University at Qingdao, and a professor at Tsinghua University in Beijing. He's written many books about Confucius models, including the China model, China's New Confucianism, Beyond Liberal Democracy. And his latest book, written with his wife WANG Pei, is called Just Hierarchy: Why Social Hierarchies Matter in China and the Rest of the World. WANG Pei is an assistant professor at the China Institute of Fudan University, and she is currently writing a book titled The Power of Calligraphy, A Political History of Calligraphy in China. So we look forward to having you come back in the future to talk about that. WANG Jianbao is perhaps the world's leading authority on Confucian theory and business. He is associate researcher at Peking University's Institute for Advanced Humanistic Studies and director of the Center for the Humanities and Business Ethics at the Cheung Graduate School of Business in Beijing. I feel I also have to mention that WANG Jianbao was a PhD student and colleague of the late, great Confucian scholar Du Weiming. So it's really an honor to have all three of you with us today. So let's start the conversation. Daniel, I'm going to start with you because you've got the new book. Both of you have the new book and you can both talk about it. So both of you, tell us a little bit about why Confucius. Why should we be talking about Confucius today? What is useful about Confucius's ideas to us today?
Well, first of all, thank you both at China Institute and CKGSB. We're honored, and we agree that it's so important to promote dialogue between the two most important countries in the world, New York and Shanghai. Now, as Confucian, we're influenced scholars. We're supposed to be modest, and to be frank, it's a little bit embarrassing, but this is our book here.
And you should all go out and buy it immediately. So I'll do the plug for you. It's called Just Hierarchy. Okay, and by the way, if you go on our website, you'll find there is a discount code for anybody who wants to buy it. So go ahead and look for that. Go ahead.
So, it's the title, to be frank, it's not meant to be provocative at all. Because if you read the Analects of Confucius, written about 2,500 years ago, it's the one text that sounds so modern. And what is it about it that sounds so modern? Well, we argue that he has a progressive, conservative perspective that we endorse. And what do we mean by progressive conservative?
Yes, means like he did this double criticism, not only on the popular views at his time, but also he did the criticism on the so-called the ancient view as well. So after this double criticism, he come to this double affirmation that he affirmed the true zeitgeist, the spirit of time, and also he felt the true tradition that he determined to inherit it. So when we are there's one example about the definition of Jun's exemplary person, because before Confucius, Jun's superior person, let's translate in this way, should be someone born from a noble family with noble blood. But ever after Confucius, Jun's the definition of Jun's slightly gradually changed into the definition that he has to be an exemplary person. So means you cannot define someone as a superior man by his blood, but rather by his virtue. So
Confucius defends hierarchies which are based on virtue and ability. And that has been very central to Chinese political culture, which has influenced other East Asian countries as well, as Professor WANG Jianbao will explain. And much of the debates in China have been over how to select and promote leaders which have above average ability and virtue, and how can they gain the trust of the people. If they serve with compassion and they gain the trust of the people, then those hierarchies are justified. Now, when you think about hierarchy in English, it sounds like, oh, you're defending hierarchy. So does that mean that you're against freedom and equality? Not at all. I mean, what's the opposite of hierarchy from a Confucian perspective?
For most of the people, the opposite of hierarchy would be like equality. But from the Confucian perspective, the opposite of hierarchy would rather be chaos.
It's chaos. So we particularly from a political point of view, we think the Confucian scholar Xunzi from the 3rd century BCE, I mean, he began with an assumption that human nature is quite self-interested. And if you just leave ourselves without any sort of social controls or moral education or rituals, the society will become chaotic. But that's precisely why, but we can overcome this kind of propensity to self-interest through moral education and through being trained in rituals. And the rituals, they're not in favor necessarily of equality. They can be hierarchical rituals so long as the people with power care about and have compassion for those with less power. And he applied this to international relations as well. And it's widely accepted today that we have states that are stronger and more powerful than others, and they have moral responsibility. And giving them power is morally justified if they could implement policies that also benefit the weaker states. How do you do that? Through participating in common rituals and a common culture that binds those states. I mean, I'm from Canada, as you know, far less powerful than the United States. And Canada doesn't aspire to have any global leadership, to be frank. But, and here we should praise the United States. I mean, Canada benefits from a hierarchical relationship with the United States because the United States spends more on military, protects Canada, and Canada could spend more on social welfare. So Canadians don't mind being a lower member of the hierarchy because they benefit from this kind of hierarchy. I think this is a very important point that the Confucians emphasize. Hierarchies are justified if the rulers have compassion and it benefits those on the bottom of the hierarchies. That's a crucial point that we really want to emphasize, that in our book we emphasize over. So that's why Confucianism in a way is so appropriate for societies today, because on the one hand it tries to take the best from the past while also having critical perspective on the present, and that's what we try to emphasize in our book as well.
Okay, so thank you so much for that brief introduction. There are a lot of points I want to come back to, but I want to first give WANG Jianbao a chance to talk about his perspective. Confucianism, Jianbao, Confucianism seems to have really come into vogue in China in the past, I don't know, decade or so. It's not only promoted by the government in China, in school education in China, but also if you go into the office of many elite business leaders, they will have a copy of the Confucian Analects on their shelf. And so I'm really curious, why is the business community so interested in Confucius? And are there particular examples of business executives who, in your mind, have really organized their companies and according to Confucian concepts?
Thank you very much, Lita, and very happy to be here to share my point of view with all the colleagues and friends and participants. Yeah, it's a very good question. First of all, Confucius is not only a Chinese value, but also a civil religion across Asia. So we call it the Confucius economy sphere, according to our Dean Xiangbin, who generated this concept in 2017. That's the first point of view. Regarding the particular question, why the business leaders are interested at the Confucius, I think we could have the following comments. First, like Jean-Peter mentioned, he believed that in the actual age, Confucian culture was the one with the highest degree of modern economic thinking. So that's first point. Second point, I think is that since the Renaissance, the West market economy based on economic rationality has achieved brilliant success. But it also brings so many challenges and problems, like the gap between the poor and the wealthy, not to mention the ecological challenges and the weakening social mobility. So we need something new to compensate the free market values. That's second point. Regarding third point, I believe that anybody, including the business people, who has more resources should have more responsibilities. So that's fair. Finally, the last but not the least, I think Confucius is kind of a spiritual source for the culture identity. If somebody has no the certain culture identity, I think he cannot have a very meaningful life. So that's why we said at Cheung Graduate School of Business that you should transfer your life from a rich life to an enriched life, and finally to an enlightened life. So all this will based on some spiritual sources, no matter from where, from Renaissance or from Greek tradition or from Hebrew tradition, as well as from Confucius traditions. The challenge is that very few business people have such kind of self-awareness. So it's our job to, how to say, discover the Confucius values beneath the ruin of history. Since the anti-tradition becomes a very strong tradition in the past 1 century, beginning with the so-called new culture movement. So especially the May 4th movement. Speaking of the examples or models of Confucian entrepreneurs, I think there are many. The first one I would mention is that Shibusawa Ikchi. He's from Japan, and he was called father of the modern Japanese corporation or the modernization of Japan. So actually, he's so successful, and he has met 5 American presidents and some other famous businessmen in America in early last century. He's famous of not only his achievement of business, but also he wrote a book. The book, I think, somebody knows, The Analects and the Abacus. So he stressed the value of Confucian entrepreneurs by this fabulous book, by the clever comparison and the combination and the interaction of the Analects and the Abacus. You know, the Abacus is ancient Chinese computer to calculate profit, but the Analect to teach you how to self-cultivate for a virtual and meaningful life.
So Jianbao, I'm going to jump in for a second and ask you before we I respond to both of you your comments. What about current Chinese CEOs? You know, are there examples of people you would consider to be true, like Wu Shang, you know, Confucian business leaders?
It's very difficult to say because we have the bureau challenges. First, to reach the economic man values. That means rationality, the rule of law and the freedom of the market. Meanwhile, we have to think ethically to care the justice of our society, I mean, for the sustainable development. So all these challenges are happening simultaneously. In that case, for Chinese businessmen, they face more challenges than the Western counterpartners. So it's difficult to say there are some typical contemporary Confucian entrepreneurs in China now, but I can mention a couple of, like the Zhang, you know, but it's 100 years ago. Nowadays, the Chinese business environment is facing some big challenges. So I hope more and more business people can commit and embrace the Confucius values.
And challenges you mean in terms of corruption, or what are the challenges? Why is it harder in China to have Confucian, you know, a business leader following Confucian ethics than it would be in the West? And then I have a bunch of questions for you, Daniel and Pei, too.
Yeah, you know, the power, I mean, the political power and the wealth has a big tension in Chinese history. So the Confucius is an independent school with dignity and value built up by some scholars without any wealth and powers in 500 BC sometimes. But after Han Dynasty, the school, I mean, this spiritual tradition was contaminated and corrupted by the power. So the tension between power and wealth is a thousands of years debate in China. Due to the superstitions of power, it leads to some corruptions in China. So that's a disadvantage for Confucius. We have to self-criticize and more reflection, self-reflection, then could explore some new values for the future development.
Okay, great, thank you. I'm gonna come back to that again because that question of self-criticism and the challenges. So, but first, I mean, this is kind of a question for all of you, but first for Daniel and Pei. I think that, you know, what you've described sounds beautiful. It's very idealistic, and who could disagree with these ideas of you know, the beneficent leaders thinking about the people and, you know, promoting policies to benefit others and having common rituals and all that. But in reality, the reality is not, that's not what it actually looks like in real life. So how? And I guess I have to jump into the question of, given that it hasn't happened in China, that's not what China looks like today, in my view. You know, what about, don't you need checks and balances? I'm not talking about a political, you know, democracy, American style democracy, but without checks and balances, how could you, these are all great ideas, beautiful ideas, but where's the reality? You're muted, we can't hear you. Yep, start again.
Any form of government has to prevent abuses, but also has to empower the government to do good things. And the emphasis is only on checks and balances, then there might be a problem with empowering the government to do good things. So, for example, on this case of fighting against COVID-19, I mean, lots of things were wrong, especially in the beginning in China, when conscientious professionals were prevented from expressing their worries about a new disease that looked a lot like SARS. And we recognized that was a mistake.
And you could say that they were true Junzi, right?
Yes, for sure. There's two, right? One is
speaking truth to power.
Yeah, exactly. One is Dr. Li Wenliang, who was one of the first to raise the alarm about this new disease and himself succumbed to the disease at the age of 34. And the other is a well,
Dr.
Dr. Zhang Nanshan,
82.
82 years old, and he was not speaking truth to power. I mean, he was part of the power structure, spoke the truth, and eventually the people came along. So in China, because of this legacy of respect for conscientious professionals, once Dr. Zhang Nanshan kind of raised the alarm on January 20th, then the central government on January 23rd could impose, I mean, it was totally radical at the time. In prior history, there's never been such a large-scale lockdown in the province of Hubei, and to a lesser extent in the rest of China, but to a much lesser extent, it should be said. I mean, Shanghai, for example, there was never, in parts of Shanghai, there was never a quarantine. But eventually, the people, the citizens were quite dutiful, and you had a strong and capable government which at all levels of government implemented policies designed to preserve what we can use liberal language, the right to life, and in a successful way. So now in Shanghai and the rest of China, we're basically free from the disease. If only the rest of the world would have come along. So it's important to have checks and balances, but it's also important to empower the government to do good things. And that's one thing that's neglected in traditions that only emphasize checks and balances.
Very, very interesting point. Yeah, a lot to think about there. So coming back again, kind of to all of you, but maybe in particular to what WANG Jianbao was talking about. You know, you talked about Confucian ethics in business, but you know, in many ways, during the May 4th movement, the intellectuals who were challenging tradition, you know, they were challenging it because for centuries and centuries, China had been following these stricter and stricter and stricter and stricter guidelines, kind of Confucian guidelines that eventually became this sort of stultifying, you know, it was choking creativity and choking, you know, by following these traditional, you know, poems that they had to write in a certain way and all that kind of stuff. And so the question I have for you, I guess, is that, you know, in many parts of the world, the Western world, I guess, the smart thinking these days, or at least the fashionable thinking, right, is that companies and institutions should promote kind of flat management, and that the idea that top-down management discourages creativity and is less efficient than a flatter, more kind of democratic structure or process. So I wonder if you can all talk about that. I mean, that idea of, you know that in history, maybe it's just because of the end of Qing dynasty, you know, corruption and whatever, but Confucianism became this, or at least intellectuals at the time felt that it became this stultifying and kind of strangling philosophy, and it did not allow for new ideas. So talk about that.
Yeah, it's a very big and good question. I try to answer your questions properly. First, Confucius has been blamed for all the shortcomings of Chinese or some weakness of the Asia. So, because we forgot the original teachings of Confucius. That's the first point. Actually, Confucius, if we simplify it into ABC, we can say that first, it's a culture with learning attitude rather than teaching, you know. For the Confucius, no any priests, no monks, no gurus. So they go to learn, not to teach somebody else. And secondly, it's kind of culture changing with the times. So it's fresh and renewed generation by generation, day by day, according to our classical teachings. And thirdly is that it's a culture for criticism, a culture with a critical spirit. It's not an adjustment to the society, but criticize and change the society, even by some kind of extreme ways. So in that case, Confucius has still the living force for the future. But as I mentioned before, that we have to discover the value of Confucius beneath the ruin of the 100 years destroy. So for the business, I think compassion or benevolence or humanity is a core value of the Confucius tradition. Mm-hmm. So if you implement or imply the compassion or sympathy, empathy in your organization, I think the hierarchy can be justified. And finally, according to the Mencius teaching, the highest level of the hierarchy is the heaven, but the normal people represent the heaven. The heaven listen as the normal people listen. The heaven looks as the normal people looks. So that means the normal people, in other words, the normal employees are at the highest level. He is the big boss rather than the owners or CEOs. Without this humble attitude, the CEOs and the owners, I mean, cannot succeed for the business. That's my general understanding. But for the typical or detailed daily management, every owner and every CEO has his own approach and smart solution.
Daniel, I think you wanted to jump in. You had something.
It's just to echo, but also Cheng, we say in Chinese, just compliment. I mean, it doesn't matter whether actually large companies inevitably are hierarchical, right? We can't avoid that. So that's not a problem. The question is, what purposes do the hierarchies serve? And as Professor WANG Jianbao just said, if there's hierarchy, but then it serves the employees and it serves others with compassion, then that's not a problem. So Confucian ethics provides a kind of standard for judging whether a company is good. If it serves the ends of compassion, ren, you know, this really central Confucian value, that's the thing to look at. Whether they're hierarchical or egalitarian is not such a big deal. And I mean, in China in 20th century, arguably a very important tradition was this tradition of anti-traditionalism. It was a very crude dismissal of the past, but we argue that, and I think Professor WANG Jianbao and Professor WANG Pei all agree that it's important to look at the past to find what works about the past, to think about reforming the present. We can't just say everything about the past was bad. It's such a crude kind of view, right? So on the one hand, we're attached to a tradition, but on the other hand, we also have a critical approach to the present that we want to improve and draw upon the past if it can help and think of new ideas if it can help. I mean, this idea that we have to choose between the tradition and social criticism or tradition and progressive outlook is ridiculous. Of course, we need both, right?
Right, it makes sense.
We have to have this double criticism first, and then we have to this double affirmation.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to ask you two tough questions before we open it up to the audience. And so Daniel, so in response to your book some years ago, The China Model, the political scientist Andy Nathan wrote, Daniel Bell is a progressive who wishes for all the right things: fair distribution, rule of law, individual security, environmental stewardship. Where his political philosophy bends to meet less progressive ideas is in its argument that a virtuous elite can make authoritarianism acceptable. So that's my question for you is authoritarianism acceptable?
Well, of course, in English, the term authoritarianism is pejorative. So, but in a political system, we also need hierarchies, right? I mean, unless it's a tiny community of 100 people, or maybe in ancient Athens, disregarding the slaves and the women, if you have a few thousand citizens, they can be equals. But in any modern society, you need political hierarchies. So again, the relevant question is what standards should we use to judge whether those hierarchies are morally justified or not? And the Confucians say, if the hierarchies serve the people with compassion in a kind of efficient way with ability, and if they can gain the trust of the people, then that works. And that's the standard that we should use to judge whether the political hierarchies are legitimate or not. Whereas I think maybe Professor Nathan and others might think that the only legitimate standard to judge political hierarchies is whether the leaders are selected by one person, one vote. That's something that obviously we think is quite dogmatic, to be frank. Yeah. I
Okay,
mean, there's universal human rights. Don't kill people, don't torture people. When you have diseases like COVID, we want to stop people from dying. But when it comes to how to select the right kind of leaders, we should allow for diversity based on a cultural foundations.
So in a moment, I'm going to ask Professor WANG Jianbao a tough question, but after that, I want to have questions from the audience. So I just want to tell everybody who's listening, if you see at the bottom of your screen, there is a hand, you can raise your hand and click on that button. And I want, then I'll look at who's raised their hands and I'll call on you and we will unmute you and you can ask your question. So, Jianbao, my question for you is, what about corruption? So, I think it was just yesterday, I was reading an article in the New York Times about the race for a vaccine against the coronavirus, right? So labs all around the world are racing and working on it. And the article said, reported that one of the labs in China that's working on a vaccine was caught up several years ago in a bribery scandal, where the lab was, somebody in the lab paid the government to try to speed up, approval for their particular medication. And so that the company, this just happens to be one small example, but it's certainly, relevant right now just because we're all thinking about the coronavirus. So again, I feel like the Confucian ethic sounds so beautiful and it is a great thing, but without a clear system of, a functional system of laws that helps block the negative aspects of guanxi, right? Everybody's playing the guanxi game. And Confucianism is a little bit about guanxi as well. It's all about relationships. What is your relationship with somebody else, right? As the foundation of social culture in China. So, but without a clear functional system of laws, how can you really fight corruption?
Okay, that's a very good question. First of all, I want to emphasize that Confucius focuses on self-cultivation rather than the social relations, means guanxi. Is self-establishment, then you can establish somebody else. Only the people can enlarge the way, not vice versa. So the self-awareness and the self-cultivation for the profound person like Zhang is most important. So Confucius is coming to change the world, not to adjust the world. That's first point of view. Second point of view, the tension between power and wealth I mentioned just now is the key reasons for the corruption. At the beginning, Confucius school was dignified with independent academic values, at the beginning. But due to the imperialism corruption, Confucianism got the power for Chinese history. Meanwhile, Confucius lost its independence. So now our job is to revive or rediscover the Confucius values to continue the good stream, not the bad stream of the long history.
Yep.
And thirdly, the corruption is, due to the market economy, to the market society. There's a famous book called What Money Cannot Buy. So before the open reform policy, Chinese people focus on the ideology struggling, like class is. Yeah. But after 1978, we transferred to the economy development. But the problem is we lost something like virtues, moralities, ethics. So we have to recover to something, classical values, to find our wandering soul. Where are we from? That's the most critical challenge for Chinese, to have the self-awareness with self-identity and a critical common sense with critical spirit. We don't have common sense for our society. For every topic, we struggled against each other on the WeChat group, so it's big debate in China. We are on the way to foster or development or develop our common values. That's a long-term challenge. Maybe it will take another 3 or 5 generations. It's called the 3 gorges of China history. So it's not 1 generation or 2 generations issue. It will be, I think, somebody says 200 or 300 years challenges. But
Wow.
we will make it. Thank you.
So Jianbao, I have to say to you that that was just beautiful what you said about finding China's wandering soul. We launched a series last year, and we're still doing this series of programs called In Search of China's Soul, based on exactly that idea that 40 years of economic development has been spectacular, but that China is still searching for its soul and trying to figure out. So I hope you'll come back and talk to us again about that stuff. That's wonderful. So I do see a bunch of hands up. I'm going to call on Jeffrey Tao, if you will. Aaron, if you could unmute him. Jeffrey, go ahead.
Hello.
Yep, we can hear you.
Can you hear me? Okay. First of all, I'd like to thank all the members of the panel and the moderator, all of you, for a very interesting discussion. My question is, maybe it's a bit too complex, but I've always thought about this and been puzzled by it. How could a system of ideas that emphasizes acceptance of hierarchy and the integrity of social relations gain traction in the United States, for instance, where we have such a strong tradition of rugged individualism, the battle between different ideas, political parties, policies, airing of views on TV and on the internet? That is the essence of what people believe to be democracy. So how can you really, except in an idealistic, theoretical, academic way, think that this could gain traction here? Also, we have Confucian institutes all over the United States and in many foreign countries, including even Israel. What do you think their role can be in fostering a true understanding of Confucianism that would lead to the kind of success that the three of you have been talking about? It's really widely regarded here as a vehicle for the projection of Chinese governmental soft power, and rather underrated, to say the least. Can you please comment?
Maybe on the question of hierarchy, I mean, it's worth noting that the US founding fathers, in a very Confucian vein, wanted to have public officials selected on a hierarchy of virtue rather than blood or family background. And that was institutionalized by such means as the Senate, which at the time was meant to select public officials on the basis of superior virtue and ability. We can also, for some a historical reason, this emphasis on this very conscious emphasis on an aristocracy or a sort of hierarchy based on virtue and ability became marginalized in popular discourse. And it's very hard to restore that. I mean, maybe the excesses of populism may lead to some rethinking, because obviously I think people now recognize there's a need for at least some sort of scientific-based hierarchy when it comes to dealing with diseases such as COVID, and that we should empower more conscientious professionals rather than political leaders who, luan shuo, who like just speak off the top of their head. And more generally, obviously there's a need to select political officials based on virtue and ability rather than money or family background. I think it's an issue that's not going to go away. On the Confucius Institutes, maybe in retrospect, it was a mistake to embed them within universities. I mean, if they had been like the Alliance Française or the Goethe Institute, who were funded by the government to project the culture of those countries, it may not have been viewed so negatively. I mean, I've participated in a lot of meetings organized by Confucius Institutes, and they work often on issues that wouldn't be worked on by other institutes. For example, dialogues between Confucian ethics and Ubuntu ethics, which is a sub-Saharan ethics, which emphasizes also community and compassion. Also one for example, in Iceland that compared the Nordic emphasis on harmony with the Confucian emphasis on harmony. I mean, these sorts of issues wouldn't be funded, sorry to say that, by more liberal groups like the Ford Foundation and so on, which they're doing great work. But the Confucian Institutes had this opportunity to do it, but because maybe just tiny proportion of what they do was viewed as government propaganda, it kind of delegitimized the whole thing, especially in Western countries, much less so in other countries, by the way, where Confucian Institutes are still thriving.
Okay, great. I'm going to call on Sandy. Who's got a question? Sandy, you can speak now. Can you hear us?
I can hear you very well.
Okay,
Thank you.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I have a question. So I am from Swaziland, and we are the only country in Africa that don't have a relationship with mainland China. So my question is, what can outsiders? What are the Confucian principles for an outsider who is interested in dealing with China?
Can you rephrase that question? Tell us again. What do you mean?
So as an outsider who is interested in dealing with China, what can I learn from Confucius so that I can better engage and deal with China? Are there any principles, especially right now, to deal with contemporary China?
Yeah.
Well, right.
Okay.
So,
actually, regarding the outsiders of China or of the Confucian economic sphere, I think the golden rule is that I will not do unto you whether you don't want me unto unto I. So that means we should respect each other, and I should not try to teach you something. I should try to learn something from you. So I think the golden rule. The second rule is that I establish myself, meanwhile, I should establish other people. So my personal success doesn't mean the all mankind success. So that's why we should have a shared future, because the sympathy and empathy is roundless. Even the nation states are rounded. So the globalization could be rounded in the future, but the sympathy and empathy is roundless. You and I are same with the same compassion and the humanities. Thank you.
I think that's a good point, but we should also look at what are some of the common values shared, for example, between Confucianism and Ubuntu, for example.
Or Confucianism and Christian.
Yeah.
Catholic.
Yeah. So you're saying that elders.
Yeah, and
for
actually
example,
there is
the idea that of respect for elders. I mean, it's marginalized, to be frank, from liberal countries, but it's so important for the rest of the world. You know, and if assuming that people have a reasonable commitment to rationality and compassion and a commitment to self-improvement, of course, people as they get older, they should become better morally and socially. It's so obvious for kind of people from East Asia and other non-Western contexts. I mean, let's focus on what we have in common too. And one of them, I think, is this respect for elders. It's so important. Like the idea, I mean, again, to relate it to this coronavirus crisis, the idea that we can have herd immunity, letting the elderly people die for the rest of society like they have in Sweden. And it's totally crazy from a kind of East Asian context. And I think probably from, I don't know enough about Swaziland to say so, but probably it's the case as well there too.
Okay, I'd love to get some more questions. So I see there's a question from Shenzhan Liao, who is the head of China Institute School. So I'd like to give her an opportunity. Shenzhan, are you there?
Thank you, Dinda.
You see a beautiful jade cabbage there in your background.
I think it's in the Taiwan Museum of
Exactly, looks like it. Anyway, go ahead, Shenzhan.
Thank you, Dinda, and thank you both, well, Professor Wang and David and Professor WANG Pei. My question, I hope it's not too big, but also I keep wondering, especially we are in the situation that COVID-19 has imposed on all of us. Are there any Confucian views regarding the relationship between human society and the nature? I know it's a big topic in terms of the relationship between Tian and Ren, or heaven, not the exact translation of Tian versus human society. But well, can Confucian views or philosophies provide any light as well we are reflecting and rethinking the human activities, whether it's socially, politically, or economically?
Great question, thanks.
Well, we will think that Confucian theories is more like for human societies. And when we are talking about human beings as a part of nature and human being trying to have this harmonious relation with nature, it's more like beyond human societies. So somehow for this question, it's better to look at the Taoist tradition. And for Taoist tradition is that human beings are not like more superior than other beings in the nature. So we have to pay respect to any kind of like existence in this nature. And for those, like for example, wild animals, they are not pets, they are not raised animals in farms. So we have to leave them alone. Like it's not to let it go. No, it's just to leave them alone, to pay respect, to not try to grab them into this human society. So I think at this point, probably it's better to look into this Taoist tradition rather than Confucian theory. That's
it bears directly on this issue of the markets that sold the wild animals, which from a Taoist perspective is great. But we want to emphasize that there's no such thing as Confucian fundamentalism. Confucians throughout history have incorporated elements of other traditions, from Taoism to legalism to Buddhism to Christianity to liberalism to feminism. It's a very open-minded and inclusive tradition and progressive tradition, yes.
Got it. I'm going to ask, I want to make sure to get a few more questions. So why don't we have two at a time? So I'm going to call on Peng, Cheung, Zhang, and I'm also going to call on Todd Cornell, I'm sorry. So why don't you both, go ahead, start Peng, Cheung, Zhang, and then Todd, and then after you've asked both of your questions, the speakers can respond. Go ahead, Peng.
Yeah, hi, thanks to the speakers. It's very interesting ideas. I have a question about the concept of li, or rituals and rites. I believe that's one of the common translations. So we know that's a very central concept to the Confucian view of society. And if you actually look at the tradition, I think that's the part where I think Confucianism probably is going to have the biggest trouble in adapting to the modern world, because first of all, the classics in the classics, it's very patriarchal. In the Li, according to the
keep your question short, okay? Because we have very little time. Go ahead.
Sorry. So I guess the thing is then how are you going to adapt that to the modern society? Because the Li it regulates all aspects of life according to the true Confucian way, and it's very patriarchal, and I think that's really at odds with what we consider modern values.
Okay, and Todd, what's your question? Hold on, let's get the second question. Todd.
Wow.
Todd, you're still muted. Okay. You're muted.
Okay, now can you hear me?
Yep, go ahead.
Okay, so I just wanted to say thank you to everybody. I really appreciate this. I'm excited to be able to take part. I'm actually going to ask my question in Chinese because I want to know the Chinese translation that you're using for compassion. 我想知道你们那个你看的是什么中文字，就把它反成 compassion 在英文里。我认为这应该是佛教的。
人
人，我认为这个翻译的不对。
Yeah, but we translate as compassion and humanity. But to get back to the first question about patriarchy and ritual.
Yeah. Yes, but in the past there is a strict like difference in between like inner and outer. So like a woman should be inner and the man should be like outer space. But it's just based on this assumption that they exclude women out of this Confucius, Cheng Ren, like to be a 君子. They exclude women from this education, Confucian education. But nowadays it's like accessible to everyone, not man, women, whatever. It just so nowadays it's not a pre-assumption anymore. And nowadays the so-called like Confucian rituals should be progressive. And now we know that even in the family of Kong, the family of Confucius, they do put like women's name into their family like family tree. Yeah, so there is something adapted to this, as I said, the true zeitgeist, the true spirit of time. So when we are talking about this Confucian rituals or whatever, we have to remind ourselves the Confucian ritual, if it is rigid, dogmatic, it should be something to be like banned or perish as May 1st, what they experienced during May 1st movement. But those Confucian rituals which are like adapted to the new modern spirit of time, that's something we should pay respect, and probably somehow we should adore that.
Yeah.
Especially in Chinese context.
So we criticize the hierarchies that are based on race or sex or caste, but or class. But we begin our book with an example of the seating hierarchies in formal meals in Shandong province, which are very hierarchical. Those with more status have a clear seating position. But in university settings, there's no sexism anymore.
Because the
president of my university is a female. So the idea that you would have we can maintain these, what's the point of these hierarchical rituals? It's to show compassion for all, to generate a sense of community. But we want to maintain those rituals without the bad parts like the sexism and the racism. The problem is not the hierarchy, it's the bad forms of hierarchy.
Jianbao, did you want to add something before I ask the last question?
Yeah, for the rites and the rituals, so many misunderstandings. First, the foundation of the rite is compassion or humanity or sympathy or benevolence. Without compassion or humanity, the rite is only some meaningless formalities. So that's the first point. The second point is Confucius is a restless horizon, is a constantly changed landscape. So the rites are also changing according to the times. And thirdly, for the Confucius tradition, rites include laws. So we must understand this, otherwise we cannot understand the law system, the legitimacy and legality in China. That's for the question. And for the third question, actually for the Buddhism, we say it's called the semi-sized Buddhism. It has been localized in China with some compassion or Ren or humanity. So I hope in the future, we could have something like ecumenical movement, including all the religions as well as Confucius, to establish our compassion for mankind. Thank you.
Wonderful. Okay, so I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and ask the last question. I'm sorry we haven't been able to get all of the questions from the audience, but maybe we could pursue that afterwards through email. So my question is about the future, and it's kind of picking up on, well, it's picking up on the threads of, all the threads that you've been, pursuing in this conversation. I remember as a student in the late 70s in Taiwan, seeing how the Chinese governments for centuries have been using Confucianism as a way to preserve their legitimacy, right? And I saw it firsthand in Taiwan. The Kuomintang was using it every Confucius Day, was this very formal, important event, and it was all involved, lots of formalism, sanjugong, and all this stuff. And so, and we see it in China now. The government, of course, is using Confucianism in the same way, and through the centuries, through the dynasties did as well. So my question is about the future, and returning to Wang Jianbao's comments about searching for China's wandering soul. What do you think China will look like, say, in 10 years? Do you think that we will see more of a kind of, putting it really crudely, more of a kind of bastardization of the, you are all about pursuing the real ethics of Confucius's teachings and the real thing. And we see all kinds of strange forms of it emerging in contemporary Chinese society that are not necessarily the real deal. So I'm wondering if you see more bastardization and kind of meaningless formalism in as Confucianism, you know, grows deeper roots in China, or do you see it reemerging as a real kind of you know, new foundation, social and spiritual foundation for Chinese society? What do you think China will look like in 10 years? That's for all of you. So we're going to go a little bit past 12 o'clock. I apologize to the audience, but it's just, I wanted to ask this one final big question. Go ahead, guys.
Please, Daniel. Yeah.
You go first.
Yeah,
you go first.
Okay.
The value of wrong is so important in Confucianism, meaning
yes, courtesy,
yeah,
civility,
deference, ability.
deference. Yes.
So as the
No,
most,
it's not a Confucian way. Confucian way.
Should go first.
Actually,
we have to let you go 3 times first.
Actually, simplify my answer is 3 E's. First, ethically. Second, ecumenically, as I mentioned just now. Third, ecologically. So ecology will be our common challenge, including this time COVID-19 virus, not to mention the climate change and so forth. So ethically, of course, we need to care all the community. I mean the fiduciary communities. Ecumenical, not only for the Christianity, but also for all the other traditional spirits and religions and social movements. So that's the first part. The second part for the coming 10 years of China is clear. One side is indigenization. It's not localization, because we have indigenized in our territory for thousands of years. It's different from USA and Australia and Canada. So it's kind of indigenization, means deepening localization. Secondly, is globalization. So globalization will never stop, but will develop more smartly and more aggressively, since we have more common challenges. So we have to work together and live together. We only have plan A. We don't have plan B, because we only have one single blue planet, the Earth. That's all. Thank you.
We agree. Just one point about the development of Confucianism in China over the past 3 decades or so. It's one of the most exciting developments in China. And to be frank, it's hardly ever discussed in the West. Basically, there's huge diverse debate. And it's one of the areas where there's no kind of official orthodoxy. That's one of the most exciting parts of being part of this debate, is that we don't exactly know where it's going to end up. And
君子和而不同.
So there's the idea that exemplary persons respect for diversity, you know, harmony.
Harmony without uniformity.
Diversity rather than conformity or uniformity. Every Chinese intellectual knows that. And actually it was even in the 2008 Olympics, the opening ceremony, that was a central value. So luckily we have this. And if the Chinese government says, this is what I mean by Confucianism, no other debates allowed, then it'll be the end of Confucianism. But actually so far, very lively, exciting debates. And how that's going to end up, it's too early to tell, but I do think for sure that there will be much, much more emphasis on Confucian values as a standards for judging progress and regress in China? For example,
for example, like for this domestic issues, we think there will be more debates on this political meritocracy, because Professor Bell started this discussion, but it's far from enough for discussion. There are so many branches we have to discuss about it, and so many details and the practices we can judge, criticize, or whatever we can to do on that. And also for this international relations, we had this argument in our book, chapter 3, that as big countries, it's not morally big. I mean, it's just have big land popularity, economy circumstances. Yes, as big countries, they have to share this bigger responsibility internationally. So China influenced Confucian influenced China should take more responsibilities to deal with the future crisis. For example, the global warming and the nuclear crisis. And also about AI, like if we are going to confront with this AGI, this artificial general intelligence in the future, how can we deal with that? We cannot rely on big companies to that. So, you know, it's just we cannot trust on this whatever based on the human weaknesses. And Confucianism do not want to take risks on that. So how can big countries take responsibility on that and try to pursue for more international cooperation on that? So I think in the future, like in China, we have to pursue for more international cooperation, and with this humble mental state, and try to be more responsible on these global issues.
Yeah, and on one issue, for example, of self-driving cars and AI, what algorithms should we program? I mean, if we use Confucian standards, it would be civility, Zhang, you know, and
courtesy,
and whereas other ethical systems might have different solutions, but in this sort of area, we should actually allow for different solutions.
Rather than efficiency.
Yeah, rather than efficiency. You know, or for example, if it's in Lhasa, in a primarily Buddhist context, you would want to program cars with special compassion for all forms of life. So they should drive slowly, not to kill too many insects. You know, we should allow for pluralism in this way, and definitely not use all universal values so-called universal values that come from one particular Western context to judge the rest of the world. That's the biggest mistake, and the one that's most offensive to people in this part of the world.
Well, I want to thank all of you speakers so much, and thanks to our viewers for tuning in to this fascinating conversation. We've heard a lot today about compassion, which we certainly know that we need in these really difficult times, and we've heard a lot about humility, which I think, you know, in looking at our geopolitical situation right now is something that we all need very much to take to heart. And I think humility is going to be important as we find our way going forward in the face of this natural disaster. So thank you so much for sharing. I think the three of you, Confucius was a great idealist, right? And I think the three of you are all Confucian idealists, and we're very grateful for your inspiring thoughts and for giving us some guidance. So I hope you will all tune into our next program, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for hosting us. It was an honor.
Thank you. Yeah, not only idealist, it's sacred as sacred.
And Confucian was actually very practical. Remember, he was a failed politician turned teacher.
Ah, yes. My favorite fact about Confucius. That's right.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right, well, that was fantastic. Thank you so much, all of you. Talk to you soon. Get some rest.
Yeah, best regards.